I'm a 17-year-old high school student with a weak body. I live in a small town in the Philippines, and this town is surrounded by rice fields with a highway going straight across it. Part of my usual weekend routine is to go jogging early in the morning, sometime around 5 a.m. My usual jogging route is from my house, somewhere in the middle of town, to a small hill with a wonderful view of the town in the morning. To reach my destination, I would have to jog on the side of the highway. From time to time, a fog that lasts for an hour would appear on the highway, and once you're inside, you could only see 10 or 15 feet before it all goes white. So one Saturday, I decided to jog. I invited one of my friends to join me since he follows the same route anyway. We left home at 5 a.m. and proceeded to the highway. As usual, a thick fog blanketed the highway. The cars that passed by had their lights on, and there were several one-ways because of road repairs. My country is currently issuing a nationwide widening of all national roads. As we entered the fog, we decided to jog along the side of the road and passed a couple of roadworks, about 100 meters long each. All was well at that point. We were a bit exhausted, but otherwise fine. We barely encountered anybody else, and usually there are fellow joggers too. That hill with a view is really famous. Then we came across another roadwork, and we saw this guy crouched down on the asphalt. He was wearing a dirty orange vest and similarly dirty hard hat. We couldn't see his face, but we just decided to ignore it. He looked as if he was fidgeting with something in his hands, so we thought he was just holding a few tools or something. Also, there was nobody there but us, me, my friend, and that guy. The fog was still thick as heck. My friend signaled me to keep a distance from the guy, and I followed him. When we got closer, we heard him humming a strange tune under his breath, which in itself wasn't that weird. But boy, were we wrong. As we got closer and closer to the guy, he started acting erratically. He stopped for a moment as I passed him. Then he started laughing. It wasn't a regular laugh, it sounded sinister and a little dry. It was really loud too, so it really freaked us out. We didn't increase our speed at that point as we thought he was just playing with us. But he didn't stop. He just kept laughing and laughing, and we knew it was beyond a prank. I can't describe his laugh more than I just did, but trust me, he wasn't faking it. We didn't look back. We were speeding up now as we were starting to see the hill. I was gasping for air, but I didn't know what would happen if I stopped. I just forced myself to keep running, and my friend did the same. He was probably 50 meters behind us when I decided to look at him. He had stopped laughing, but now he was standing straight and was glaring at us. He called out to us in an enraged tone. That's when adrenaline kicked in. I just ran and ran until we reached the hill. In hindsight, I don't know how I was able to push myself that far for so long. When we finally arrived at the top of the hill, we were exhausted. I nearly collapsed on a cement bench and stayed there for another hour. Like a breath of fresh air, my friend laughed in a more comedic manner, and I followed suit. We laughed the whole thing off while waiting for the fog to lift. When it did, we walked home. I hadn't had breakfast yet, so I was pretty hungry. As we passed the roadwork, we saw the guy in. He was no longer there. The only people there wearing construction outfits were the ones signaling the traffic, but none looked like the man we saw. As I got home, I told my parents what happened, and they said it was probably just another nut job, which was common in my town, that stole a construction outfit. Since then, I never went jogging into a fog again. This happened when I was around 12 while traveling a stretch of road between a large Irish town and a not-so-large Irish town with my mother and niece, 11 at the time. My niece and I were buckled up in the back, my mother was driving, and aside from the fact that the weather was eerie as hell, densely foggy with that almost gaseous drizzle you get sometimes, nothing untoward had occurred. So about 3/4 of the way to this town, still driving in dense fog, we see roadwork signs ahead, meaning all traffic had to squeeze through a gap not much wider than a car on one side of the road. As we approach this gap, my mother practically slams on the brakes. This figure, completely out of nowhere, had staggered out of the fog onto the main road and just stood there, directly in line with the gap. We could see it was a woman now, let's pretend her name was Jane to make this easier to type, wanders forward towards the car, looking awfully disoriented. Now bear in mind this is a mother and two young enough teens, so she's obviously a bit sketchy about this individual blocking the road and approaching her car in a fairly isolated area in dense fog. So Jane wanders around to the side door across from my mother and pulls it open. And I do believe my mother would have locked it beforehand, or kept driving had she expected the woman to do this. but it was just such a sudden movement that none of us really could have predicted it. So Jane sits in the car, this kind of faraway look in her eye, wearing a fluorescent red rain jacket, and places this plastic bag awkwardly onto the floor. My niece and I are exchanging glances, and I recall my mother politely but firmly asking her to get out of the car. So Jane closes the door and refuses, and I recall her saying something like, "No, you have to take me into town," as though it were an obvious fact that she was surprised we weren't aware of. So my mother berates her mildly about wandering out in front of traffic, stating that you'd have to be mad to do so in this weather, and Jane responds with, and I quote, "I know. Not sorry, nothing normal, just agreed." So we aren't far from town, and my mother decides to drive on. We'll drop Jane off, and we'll be fine. So we're driving off, and my mother is again cautiously questioning Jane about what she thought she was doing, with Jane just continually insisting in this blank monotone voice, "You just need to drop me into town," all the while staring blankly out into the fog. My niece and I are obviously a bit spooked, unsure if you all know that feeling where someone is just giving off creepy vibes, like you can't put your finger on it, but something is definitely wrong here. So my mother glances back briefly, checking if we were fine, and we sheepishly confirm as much. But no sooner have we spoken than Jane whips her head around wildly, as if something's bitten her. I kid you not. It looked like she genuinely hadn't even noticed we were in the back seat. Might as well have just been Jane and my mother for all she was concerned. She spent a good 5 to 10 seconds eyeing my niece before staring directly at me for at least as long, fingers grasping her plastic bag, the contents of which I'll never know, her eyes boring into mine, with this genuinely uncomprehending look on her face, as though I had suddenly sprouted wings or told her she was on Saturn or something. So she slowly, eyes not leaving me till her head was fully around, turned back to her listless stare out the front window, and the drive continues as normal, none of us opting to further continue a conversation with her. We're approaching the town in question, in which we don't live, I might add. We take a turn just before the bridge into the town. My mother explains calmly to Jane that we're dropping her at the bridge and she can walk in. It's literally 2 minutes into the center of the town from this bridge, but Jane is furiously shaking her head. No, you can't drop me here." Again, it's in that tone as though we're idiots and it's blatantly obvious we couldn't possibly drop her here. My mother asks why, and in a faraway tone receives, "You're just going to have to drop me into town." I'll mention, it wasn't as though she was being rude with these statements, not intentionally anyway. She just sounded genuinely confused that we were questioning her command to drop us into town. It sounded like she thought we had missed some serious reason as to why we just had to drop her straight in, and she couldn't figure out why. Anyway, rather than arguing, likely uselessly, with Jane, my mother crosses the bridge, drives into the square, and lets Jane go. After a few awkward seconds of Jane glancing around, she grasps her bag against her, pulls the door open, gives me and my niece one final confused eyeballing session, and stumbles out. It's raining heavily now, but of course Jane doesn't put the hood of her raincoat up. She just wanders almost aimlessly off, car door still hanging open. No explanation, no thank you, no voiced goodbye, just gone. Now some of you are likely going to comment that Jane probably had some issues with her mental health, and that's entirely likely, but I'd just like to reaffirm the gut feeling of wrong permeating from this woman. It felt as though she really shouldn't have been there, wandering that lonely road in the late winter evening, and after a brief three-way debate on the woman after her departure, I'll admit it was a cold, uncomfortable, and still faintly eerie ride home the last few dozen miles in the fog. I don't know what brought Jane to that patch of road miles from anywhere that evening. If she was mentally capable of being out by herself, what put her in such a lost and confused state of mind? If she was indeed in need of help, what or who had landed this clearly confused woman in the middle of nowhere? These questions I nor you shall never know the answer to, but I can say for a certainty, Jane is likely still out there, and I just hope to hell that I don't pick her up again. It was an average winter day, around 2 years ago. I was 16 and well removed from my encounter with the Michael Myers impersonator, which is a story of its own. Since then, my family had moved down south to Florida, and nothing out of the ordinary had happened to me. School starts at 7:25 where I live, but I had to go in a half hour earlier as I had an AP Chem test. I lived around 30 minutes away from school, so my mom and I left the house at around 6:25. It was very, very foggy out that morning. It was also pitch black out. You virtually couldn't see right in front of you. So we got in the car and began our drive to school. It was so hard to see outside. We went only around 20 miles on a 35-mile-per-hour road because we had no way of seeing around us. Eventually, we got to a 4-way stop sign. To our immediate left was a Subway, and to our immediate right was a hair salon. On the other side of the stop was a strip mall and a convenience store. From the store's parking lot, we could see a car was stopped and waiting to turn right, the direction we were going. It was odd that he wasn't going though, because we weren't even stopped at the 4-way yet. When we continued driving, he pulled out after us. Creepy, but the viewing constraints took most of our attention. A few seconds after pulling out, he begins to flash his brights at us. We're worried now. He continues to do it, probably around 20 times in a row. Now we're terrified. We know nothing is wrong with the car, so his motives must be malicious. 2 minutes later, we got to a red light. We were going to take a right at the light, continue down a ways, and then make a left onto the highway, our usual way of going to school. However, Flash Bright was still behind us, still flashing his brights. My mom was going to make a quick stop at the red light and then book it, so we stopped quickly. But before we could turn, the car hit us from behind. At this point, we're beyond every adjective you can use to describe being scared. We turned and sped the rest of the way to my school. Luckily, nothing happened. In all honesty, I'm not sure what this person's intentions were. When my mom got home, we looked at the car and saw nothing wrong with it. We believe he probably saw the lack of visibility as an advantage to harm someone. He tried to get our car to pull over by flashing his lights, and when that didn't work, he tried to forcefully get us to pull over. With me being in the car, I'm now 6 feet-ish, 200 pounds. I was probably around the same then. I don't think anything would have happened, but my mom is 5 feet and barely 100 pounds. The thought of anyone doing anything to her is disgusting.